By the late 19th century, however, the craft of iron smelting was in decline. In most villages, furnaces fell into disuse and the amount of iron produced came down. Why was this so? One reason was the new forest laws that you have read about chapter 4 when the colonial government prevented people from entering the reserved forests. How could the iron smelters finding wood for charcoal, and where could they get iron or defying forest laws? They often entered the forests secretly and collected wood, but they could not sustain their occupation on this basis for long. Many gave up their craft and looked for other means of livelihood. Next, in some areas, the government did grant access to the forest, but the iron smelters had to pay a very high tax to the forest department for every furnace they used. This reduced their income. Next, moreover, by the late 19th century, iron and steel was being imported from Britain. In India began using the imported iron to manufacture utensils and implements. This inevitably lowered the demand for iron produced by local smelters. By the early 20th centuries, the nations producing iron and steel faced a new competition. Next, iron, the year was 1992. In the hot month of April, where an American and Darboji Tata, the eldest son of Jamuna Seji Tata, were traveling in Chhattisgarh in search of iron ore deposits. They had spent many months on a costly venture looking for source of good iron ore to set up a modern iron and steel plant in India. Next, Jamsetji Tata had decided to spend a large part of his fortune to build a big iron and steel industry in India, but this could not be done without identifying the source of fine quality iron ore. Next, one day after traveling for many hours in the forest, where and dropped the come upon a small village and found a group of men and women carrying basket loads of iron ore. These people were the Agricia. Next, when asked where they had found the iron ore, the Agris pointed to a hill in the distance where the Darobji reached the hill after an exhausting trek through dense forests. On exporting the hills, the geologists declared that they had at last found what they had been looking for, Rajahara hills, and one of the finest orange in the world. Next, but there was a problem. The region was dry and water necessary for running the factory was not to be found nearby. The Tatas had to continue their search for a more suitable place to set up their factory. However, the Agrais helped in the discovery of a source of iron ore that would later supply the Bhilai steel plant. Next, a few years later, a large area on forest was cleared on the banks of the river of set up the factory and an industrial township, Jamshedpur. Here there was water near iron ore deposits. The Tata Iron and Steel Company, TISCO, that come up began producing steel in 1912. Next, TISCO was set up at an opportune time. All through the late 19th century, India was importing steel that was manufactured in Britain. Next, expansions of the railways in India had provided a hug market for rails that Britain produced. For a long while, British experts in the Indian Railway were unwilling to believe that good quality steel could be produced in India. Next, by the time TISCO was set up, the situation was changing. In 1914, the First World War broke out. Steel produced in Britain now had to meet the demands of war in Europe. Next, so imports of British steel into India declined dramatically, and the Indian Railway turned to TISCO for supply rails. Next, as the war dragged on for several years, next, TISCO had to produce sail and carriage well for the war. Next, by 1919, the colonial government was buying 90% of the steel manufactured by TISCO. Next, over time, TISCO became the biggest steel industries within the British Empire. Next, in the case of iron and steel, as in the case of cotton textiles, industrial expansions occurred only when British imports into India declined and the market for Indian industrial goods increased. Next, this happened during the First World War and after is the nationalized movement developed and the industrial class became stronger. The demand of government protections became louder, struggling to retain its control over India. The British government had to concede many demand in the last decide to colonial roles.